Hello and welcome to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. Today we are talking weanlings, and I hope you're ready for a bit of a journey because there is no time in horse nutrition where you need both art and science more than when you are feeding a weanling. The science tells you the numbers, how fast they should grow, how much protein, which minerals, in what ratios, and those numbers matter enormously. Get them wrong and you're looking at bone disease, stunted growth, a horse that never reaches what it was born to be. But the art is standing in front of that weanling and reading them, seeing what the numbers can't always tell you, knowing when something's off before it shows up on a growth chart. I have spent more of my career with weanlings than with any other type of horse, thousands of them over 25 years, and I can tell you, you can see the difference between a weanling fed well and one that isn't. You can see it in how they stand, how well they're muscled, and the big one, how their legs look. But there is a lot you can't see too, like how fast they're actually growing or whether they are getting enough calcium. So you need both art and science to do the best possible job. During a recent trip to Japan, where I work on their biggest breeding farms, one of the farms wanted me to assess their entire weanling crop, all of them. They were bringing these babies to me rapid fire, one after the other, weanling in front of me, full diet history, body weight plotted over time. I was looking at legs, body condition score, muscles, eye, diet, growth curve, then legs, body condition score, muscles, eyes, diet, growth curve. More than 100 weanlings in a few hours and my head was absolutely spinning. But that experience, and honestly the thousands of weanlings before and after it, only served to reinforce what is really important. Getting nutrition right in this tiny window of a horse's life is critical. It is the foundation for a lifetime of health and soundness, and it takes that combination of feel and data to do the best job. These funny, curious, chaotic little creatures are walking a tightrope every single day, growing fast enough to reach their genetic potential, but not so fast that they end up with bone or joint disease. And what you feed them in this window, I think it matters more than at any other time in a horse's life. Today, we're talking energy, protein, minerals, what your weanling actually needs, how much, and 3 practical ways to feed them depending on your situation. Because the goal isn't a restricted diet. The goal is a balanced one, and there is a very big difference. So with all of that said, let's get into the details of feeding a weanling. So my focus with weanlings over the years has largely been in the thoroughbred industry. I've worked with weanlings of so many different breeds in so many different industries, but because of the practice of radiographing joints prior to sales, the thoroughbred industry puts a huge emphasis on weanling growth and development and joint health. So where I want to start is with energy, because energy intake controls growth rate, and growth rate is really what will determine joint health and whether your weanling will end up with any number of developmental orthopedic diseases that they are prone to. So these are things like OCD or bone cysts or physitis or contracted tendons. They're some of the ones that I see the most and the highest up on the list of risks for weanlings. So these babies are essentially walking an energy tightrope. We want them to have enough energy that they grow to their full genetic potential, or, in an industry like the thoroughbred industry where a lot of weanlings are going to go on and be sold as yearlings, we're wanting them to grow to be big enough at that yearling stage to fetch a good price when they do end up at sale. But even if you're not selling your young horses at yearling stage, you still want them to grow to their genetic potential. We don't want to stunt them in this early phase of their life. So we need to feed them enough energy, but we don't want to feed them too much energy because they have a massive ability to grow really quickly, and we could feed them if, in the production animal industry, is the nutrition focus is how do we get these animals to grow as quickly as possible so that we can sell them and realize our profits from farming them. But with young horses, we want them to grow fast enough, but not so fast that they'll start to cause joint disease, because unlike production animals, we want these horses to be with us, I've got a horse now in her late 30s, so they live for a very long time, and we want to keep them sound and healthy and able to be ridden or driven or whatever it is we do with our horses. We want them to do that comfortably without pain for as long as possible throughout their lifetime. And the foundation for that really starts when a horse is young. It actually starts in utero, But we won't cover that in this podcast because it's too big a subject. So we'll just focus on looking at their nutrition from weanling age. Now, what I am not going to cover in great detail in this podcast is the actual process of weaning. So I'm sort of going to start, I guess, from when they are weaned, but it is really important to also think about the process of weaning. And I might cover that in another podcast. Very briefly, prior to weaning, make sure that your foals are already eating the feed ingredients that you want to feed them as a weanling, so that when you wean them, they don't have, the loss of milk from the diet and the loss of their bond with their mum and a change in feed to cope with. So we can remove that stress of changing feed at weaning time by making sure that we're feeding them already what you're going to wean them onto, and then we continue that feed once they are weaned. So that's a really, really brief take on the nutrition of a foal into weanling, and I'll do that in a separate podcast when we're talking about pregnant mares and lactating brood mares, and I'll cover that weaning process as well for you at a later date. So we've got a weanling, and they're walking this tightrope of enough energy so that they grow to their full genetic potential, but not so much that they grow too quickly. And what the science shows us is that if the one repeatable way to cause joint disease in young horses is to feed them too much energy and make them grow faster than what they should be growing. That is it's a really reliable way to cause joint disease in young horses. So this is where this tightrope comes in. We need to make sure that we're not feeding them so much that they're growing too quickly and causing these joint diseases. So young foals grow extremely fast. They're growing at well over a kilo a day when they're very young. By the age of about 4 months, they will have just dropped down under the kilo a day. So they'll be around 900 grams per day, which for anyone who speaks in pounds, that's a couple of pounds a day that they're growing. So it's quite quickly. And then by 6 months, we're back to around 750 grams per day growth rate. And then by the time they get to 12 months, they're just over half a kilo, so 550 kilograms per day, which is just over a pound per day growth rate. It's still quite a fast growth rate, but they do slow down over time. So when you look at a growth curve for a weanling, what we want to see is that their growth is steady. So they grow, like they're obviously getting heavier over time, and we want to see them getting heavier over time in a smooth curve. We don't want to see that they, jump up in body weight and then flatten out for a period of time and then jump up in body weight again, or even lose weight. Weanlings will often lose weight for a number of reasons, which we'll talk about throughout the podcast, but we don't want to see them lose weight and then, have this rapid period of growth again, because it's that growth pattern where they're either going through periods of not growing, not putting on weight at all, or not putting on enough weight for a period of time, or losing weight. Those periods will nearly always, and in fact, I'm going to say will always, as long as the weanling, if it was sick, gets better again, or whatever was causing the slow growth is actually resolved, they will always then follow those slow growth rate periods or the weight loss periods with a period of very, very rapid growth, because there's this mechanism in all animals. And in fact, I see it in my kids, which is hilarious to me when I see it in my kids, but there's a mechanism called compensatory growth, which the rule of compensatory growth basically says that provided that an animal is able to, so it's got the nutrition and it's got the basic health status to allow it to, it will reach a certain weight at a certain point in time. So if you have got a young horse that doesn't grow or is losing weight over a period of time, its body essentially puts its foot on the accelerator for growth, and it releases hormones that will drive hunger, and it releases hormones like more growth hormone that will drive growth, and it will shoot the animal into a period of compensatory growth. And for a period of time, they'll eat a lot and they'll grow really, really quickly. And I've seen this. I used to spend, in my early consulting days, I used to spend days and days and days at a time looking at growth curves for weanlings. I got to the point where I was like, I never want to see another growth curve for a weanling in my entire life. I actually find them quite fascinating, but at that time I was really sick of them because I did so many of them. And consistently, I would see this. If any weanling plateaued or lost weight for a period of time, as long as whatever the issue was got resolved, that weanling would take off into this rapid period of growth. So, you might see them grow at, say, 6 months of age, they might grow at 200 grams a day, which is well below the 0.75 or 750 grams a day they should be growing. And if they did that for a month or 6 weeks, you would then see that they would shoot into this period of growth that could have been up to anywhere like 1.5 kilograms a day. So they put on a massive amount of weight and they get themselves back to where they should have been had they been growing at the right period of growth the whole time. I can see that really clearly in my head because I have looked at so many growth curves, but I hope that it makes sense to you. So if you grabbed a piece of paper and drew an X and Y axis, so one line down the page, one line across the page, and then drew like a pretty curve upwards, that's what we want our weanlings' growth curves to look like. What happens when they have these staggered growth is essentially it starts to look like a set of stairs. It'll go flat and then it'll go almost straight up and then it'll go flat and then up. That's what we want to avoid in weanling nutrition. We want to, as much as possible, we want to keep them growing as smoothly as possible. Now, that sounds easy in theory. It's really, really hard to achieve in practice. So it's not about getting this perfect. It's getting it as close to a smooth growth curve as we possibly can. Because the thing with weanlings is they are very, very sensitive to climate and they are very sensitive to changes in the forage quality of their diet or their energy intake. So let's look at their forage quality first. So imagine we have a lot of weanlings. Weanlings are often on pasture, in fact, nearly always on pasture. I can't really think of too many weanlings that are not on pasture for at least part of their weanling period. So obviously in very cold climates, like we keep horses in Japan, it's snow for a lot of the time when horses are weanlings up there, which adds I'll talk about that in climate in a second. But when they're on pasture is constantly changing in quality, and particularly in Australia. I see it less in Japan. It tends to stay quite green throughout the whole spring, summer and early autumn period. It doesn't fluctuate as much in quality, but in Australia and in the Hunter Valley, where I've spent an awful lot of time with weanlings, we can go from having lush green pasture to being dry, crisp brown pasture in weeks. So particularly in the late summer period or in autumn if we don't get rain. So at the moment we have our weanlings here in Australia and it is very, very dry. So at the moment, as an example, the pasture quality is really poor. And if we're not on top of the fact that these weanlings are not going to be getting very much energy or protein from their pasture, what will happen is their growth will really slow down. So if we're not supplementing them properly to compensate for the fact that the pasture is low quality, they'll have really slow growth. And then if it rains, so let's say we come into winter and it rains and all of a sudden we get this beautiful winter pasture growth, which we will get here in the Hunter Valley because it's not cold enough for the pasture to just die off completely. And in fact, it's some of our best pasture is grown there over winter. If we're feeding these youngsters to compensate for this really brown pasture, and then all of a sudden they get this really high quality green pasture and we don't adjust the amount of hard feed that we're giving them, their growth will absolutely take off. So if we're not really conscious of what the pasture base of the diet is doing and we don't adjust the concentrate feed that's being fed over the top of that, we have the ability to push these young horses into really, really rapid growth. Or the other way around, if we're not feeding very much because the pasture quality is so good and then all of a sudden your pasture quality drops off and we don't adjust their hard feed or their concentrate feed to increase their energy intake when that happens, then their growth rate will drop right off. So it's this constant game of reading what the horse is doing, what the forage base of the diet, particularly if it's pasture, is doing, and adjusting your hard feed or your concentrate feed, supplementary feed that you're feeding them on top of the forage to make sure that we are keeping their diet and their energy intake at the level they need to grow at an optimum rate. So this is why I say, like, the art and the science of feeding a weanling. There is no time in horse nutrition, I think, where you use the art of nutrition more than with a weanling, because it's almost like you have to be 2 steps ahead of them to know what's coming so that you can adjust their diet properly. And it's possible to keep hay-based diets a little bit more consistent, particularly if you're buying hay in large quantities. It's not going to change as quickly or as dramatically usually as what pasture will change, but you do still need to be conscious of the fact that if your hay is changing in quality or energy content or protein content, then you're going to need to adjust their supplementary feed to balance that up so that you can keep them growing in this nice steady rate throughout their weanling period. Now, the other thing that affects them massively is the climate. So I have, and I don't quite know why, but I have this really distinct memory of being an undergrad at UNE and in some kind of nutritional animal production lecture. And I remember being taught about lambs and how their surface area to volume ratio is so huge that they're really, really prone to hypothermia and that they will die quite easily in very cold conditions, and how you had to be very careful. And there was something about brown fat. They're burnt with this brown fat and they're able to burn that up when they're babies. All completely useless information from the perspective of feeding a weanling. But what it taught me was that young animals do have this huge surface area to volume ratio. So they've got lots of skin for very much inside content, which means that they lose heat really, really easily. And weanlings burn up massive amounts of energy just in keeping warm during winter or in cold climates, because they're offloading so much heat to the atmosphere because they've got this huge skin surface area and not a whole lot of substance. So, and if you look at a weanling and you can go, oh yeah, I see that. There's really not a lot to a weanling. And weanlings living in extremely cold climates, so where they have weanlings in Japan where I work, it can get down to minus 20 degrees Celsius, like really, really cold. Like that's Nerida dies in those temperatures cold. I don't handle cold weather very well. Or in climates where it doesn't rain, in climates where it doesn't snow but it does rain, I think that's almost worse for weanlings, because all of a sudden they go from having this, big fluffy coat that can keep them warm in dry weather to having that coat wet and stuck to them. And when you're wet, obviously, we all know this, when you're wet, you offload heat so much faster. That's why we feel cold if you jump out of a shower in a cold bathroom in winter and you're wet and it's freezing because your skin is wet and it's offloading a lot of heat to the atmosphere. So I actually struggle more with weanlings in climates like New Zealand and Australia where it rains a lot during winter, versus the horses that you would think that they would really, really struggle in the snow. But I guess in the snow they're so dry that they've got their coat all puffed up and it actually acts as a really good insulator for them, and they don't seem to struggle as much. Don't get me wrong, it is hard to get weanlings to grow in the middle of winter in Japan or in the States where it's also snowing, but I do really, really struggle with young horses in wet climates over winter. There was one winter here, I lose track of time, and the breeding season just seems to go around and around and around and around, and like before you've just progressed weanlings onto yearlings, and then before you know it, you've got weanlings again. So it was a few years ago, but it was really wet in winter and there was nowhere dry even for the youngsters to go and lie down. So, they love to lie down and sleep, but every time they lied down, they would get soaking wet, and then it would rain and they'd get soaking wet again. And it was almost impossible to get weanlings to grow in that winter. And sometimes you just have to accept that we can't force nature. We couldn't feed them any more energy to make them grow faster, because then we risked disturbing their gut health. So if they've fed grain-based feed, so if we were trying to feed them more grain-based feed, then we were just going to do damage to their hindgut, which is something that I really wanted to avoid. But we also couldn't keep them dry, we couldn't keep them warm enough, and we couldn't get enough feed into them to make them grow. It is really, really important when it is wet to make sure that your weanlings have got enough forage, because it's the fermentation of forage in their hindgut that actually creates a lot of heat And it's that heat that will keep them warm from the inside out. So do make sure they've got a lot of forage. And also a strategy that I find works really well when it's raining is that so a weanling, let's say a thoroughbred weanling, they're around 250 kilograms when they're 6 months old. And generally my rule is that I wouldn't go over 2.5 kilograms of concentrate feed for a 250 kilogram weanling. So 2.5 kilograms for 250 and then, 3 kilograms for a 300 kilogram weanling. That's my upper limit. So if you're below that level, so let's say we're feeding weanlings 1.5 kilograms a day and then they've got ample access to pasture and they're also getting lucerne or alfalfa hay each day during dry weather. If it rained, I would give those weanlings another 0.5 to 1 kilogram of hard feed per day, just depending on how cold it is and how windy it is while it's raining. So you can adjust, and this is all part of the art and the science, is you can adjust what you're feeding them to compensate for what the weather's doing. So when it's sunny and it's reasonably warm and it's dry and they're able to fluff their little coats up and keep themselves reasonably warm in winter, then you might have an amount you feed them during that weather. And then if it's wet and windy or just like particularly cold and windy, anything that is going to make them burn more energy up to create body heat to maintain their body temperature, you can increase their concentrate feed during those periods of time so that you can compensate for them, I guess, that they're using up more energy to stay warm. And it's that constant adjusting of what you're feeding them according to what the weather's doing or according to, like we spoke about before, what the pasture's doing. When you're constantly adjusting it, it means that you're not going to shoot them into a period of really rapid growth because you're being really aware of what their energy requirements are, how they're changing according to different conditions, environmental conditions that they're in, and you will hopefully be able to give them enough energy to keep them at a pretty consistent rate of growth. So I had an interesting phone call from a farm over in New Zealand, and they'd been feeding the same feed to their weanlings for years in the same amount. And New Zealand at this particular time had an unseasonably warm. It was either autumn or winter. I can't remember. I think it might have been an autumn. So had an unseasonably warm autumn, and they were, and also dry. It was normally quite wet where this farm is, and they had a drought, so it was dry and it was a lot warmer than normal. But the reason they called me was that they had a lot of weanlings, and from memory it was like a number of them each day showing up with this condition. But they had a number of weanlings that were presenting with what they call contracted tendons. We also call it going over at the knee. So these are the weanlings that you'll see them standing, and they'll either be obviously bent forward in their front legs. So their front leg, instead of going almost straight up and down, will come down and bend out to the knee and then back to the fetlock and hoof on the ground. So it's like their front legs are bent forward. And when it's only very minor, you mightn't see that it's bent forward, but their little front legs will have a tendency to pop forward. So they'll be standing there, and then their knee will sort of want to pop forward, and then they might pop it back again, and then they'll pop forward. If you've watched enough weanlings, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And this farm had a number of their weanlings presenting with this condition each day. We call it contracted tendons. It's not actually a contracted tendon. What happens is that their bones in their legs grow faster than what their tendons grow. So the tendons are too short, which is what contracts that front leg and pulls it so that it actually bends forward, and they find it hard to keep their knee straight. It's an issue of rapid growth. So when they grow really rapidly, their bones grow faster than their tendons. And if they grow too fast, then their bone essentially just outgrows their tendon. So what had happened in this case, and it took us a little while to figure it out. I was racking my brains trying to work it out. And then eventually we got to, what is the climate doing? What does it normally do? And yeah, they said that normally it is cold and wet. This year it was warm and dry, but they hadn't adjusted what they were feeding. So these weanlings would normally burn up all of these excess calories just in maintaining their body weight. But because it was dry and warm, they all of a sudden had all of these extra calories that they could just put towards growth. So instead of staying warm, they were growing faster, and they were growing so fast that they were causing this contracted tendons issue. So when we cut their feed back, to better match what the climate was doing, then the problem went away because we slowed their growth down. They weren't getting as many calories or not as much energy in their diet. They weren't growing as quickly, and we were able to stop them from getting contracted tendons. And the ones that did have contracted tendons, their tendons eventually catch up to their bones, and so their legs straighten back up again. But it was just I've never forgotten that one because it was just a really good demonstration to me of just how important climate is when we're feeding weanlings. So we either need to be really conscious that the climate is not going to make them grow so slowly. So say over winter, for example, if you're not onto the fact that your weanling is going to slow its growth down over winter, when you get to spring, the weather warms up, often the pasture quality improves, and they will take off in that period of compensatory growth. And that's a really high risk period for them getting any number of developmental orthopedic diseases. Or in the reverse, like I just spoke about, if your climate is allowing them to grow really quickly because they're not burning up a whole lot of energy to stay warm, they'll just grow too quickly in the moment. And you've got to always be thinking about what is their forage quality doing, what is the climate doing, and how is that going to affect how much energy they need in their diet. Hey, quick pause. If you're trying to figure out what to feed your horse, you don't have to do it solo. The My Happy Horse app helps you make sense of nutrition clearly, calmly, and without overwhelm. It's like having me in your pocket when you need reassurance the most. Visit myhappy.horse or grab it from the App Store. Okay, let's get back into it. The other part of the energy conversation, so energy and calories are exactly the same thing. I use them interchangeably all the times in case I was confusing you there. Sorry, I did swap between them without explaining that. But the other thing we need to monitor with weanlings is their body condition score. So their body condition score is how much fat they have on their body, and typically I will use their neck. So about halfway down their neck, I'll sort of want to pinch up where their mane comes out to see, is it just skin there, or can I start to feel a little bit of fat being put down in that area? And then also over their ribs, I will use a lot. It's a really interesting thing to body condition score weanlings in Australia because we tend not to handle them as much here as we might do in other parts of the world. Doing it in Japan is easy peasy because those babies are handled from the day that they're born, and they are amazing to work with. And in fact, the Japanese all laugh at me because I'm so cautious with their weanlings, and they just walk in and pick up their feet and do whatever. And I'm approaching them like I would any normal weanling, quite cautiously. But I tend not to use any part of over their rump or their tail head with weanlings because I don't want to get kicked. So just their neck and their ribs will give you a good enough indication of what their body condition is doing. But with weanlings, you really don't want them to have fat over their ribs. Typically, if they have fat over their ribs or fat being laid down on their neck, they're in too heavy body condition. There is massive variation, though, in what a normal body condition is for individual weanlings. So some will tend to be really lean over their ribs and you won't ever get fat over their ribs. And others tend to be reasonably soft over their ribs and you won't ever see them sort of, not soft as in you can't feel their ribs. You should always be able to feel. I'm a nutritionist. I've got feed on my brain. You should always be able to feel a weanling's ribs. But when I say soft, I'm trying to describe what I see all the time. So some weanlings are actually quite hard over their ribs. Like they look ribby. They can be really muscly, but there's just no softness over their ribs whatsoever. And then others, you won't be able to see their ribs, but when you feel them, they're right there. They're right underneath the skin. But if they get any softer than that over the ribs, where you're having to use any kind of pressure to feel their ribs, they're in too much body condition. But the tricky thing with body condition is that weanlings tend to, and I notice kids do the same thing. So they'll tend to get like almost a little bit chubby for a while, and then all of a sudden they grow. So the reality is they don't actually grow steadily. So they're not putting on, exactly 0.9 kilograms of weight per day. my observation is that they'll tend to put on some condition, like they seem to like almost store up a little bit of condition and then they'll grow. But if you measure their body weight, every 4 to 6 weeks and average it out, that's where you get this average daily gain of around, when they're 6 months, 750 grams a day, or when they're 12 months, 550 grams a day. So my observation is that a lot of weanlings tend to almost look a little bit chubby and then they'll grow and they'll kind of become a little bit lean again. So their condition score will change a little bit, but if you've got a weanling, just have your hands on them all the time so that you know what their body condition feels like. If you do feel them getting too heavy in body condition, it might be an indication that you do actually need to back off their feet a little bit. But the best tool, and seriously the best tool when you are managing weanlings, is a set of weigh scales. Because you can't always tell, and in fact, I'm going to say you can't tell how fast a weanling is growing just by looking at their body condition. Because, like I said, like they tend to not grow so much, but put on condition, and then they'll grow, and then they become a little bit leaner again. So if you're just interpreting growth via body condition, it's really, really hard to know what they're doing. But if you've got both their body condition and their growth rate, then you can manage them really closely. So if you've got both high body condition score and high growth rate, then your developmental orthopedic disease risk is really high. And when both of those are high, it is telling you there is too much energy in these horses' diet. So energy comes from your forages. So maybe your forages are too high in quality. If you're feeding any kind of concentrate, fortified feed, or grains, or high energy fibers, that is going to be driving a lot of the energy in your weanling's diet. So when both body condition score and growth rate are high, there's too much energy in the diet, and you need to adjust the diet to bring energy down. Now, I will say here, this is where our My Happy Horse nutrition app is absolutely at its best. So it's super hard to adjust a weanling's diet without having some way to calculate exactly what you're feeding, because the energy level is really important, but you also have to balance up your energy with your protein and definitely with your minerals. And we'll talk about protein and minerals more soon. But just to say, my head is like a human calculator for horse nutrition. I can often work out horses' diets in my head. I don't need to use software as much, but with a weanling, I will never do it without using our app, because I know that I can get it wrong so easily. So it's really important to have and this again, this is the art and the science. It's really important to use the science that we know about to manage your weanlings to get the best possible result, because it's so important to make sure that you've got their energy level right, and then the amount of energy you're feeding match with the amount of protein you need and the amount of minerals they need, because all of those nutrient requirements are affected by how fast your horse is actually growing. You can also have a low body condition score and a high growth rate. So this is those weanlings that they're always just hard over the ribs and they don't put any fat in their neck. They will just grow. So you can feed them heaps of feed, make them grow really, really fast, and they will never put on body condition. So they'll put on weight and they'll put on muscle, but they won't accumulate fat. So this is where I'm saying you need to be using both body condition and, if you can, their growth rate to know exactly how fast they're growing so that you can manage their developmental orthopedic disease risk. So anytime growth rate is too high, you need to adjust the energy intake in that diet down, because that fast growth rate is what will put them at really high risk of orthopedic diseases. I should say here too, I have noticed without a shadow of a doubt, there is 3 different types of weanlings. So there are ones that are not genetically predisposed to some developmental orthopedic diseases. So I think pretty much every weanling is going to be susceptible to things like contracted tendons, because that's a real physical thing. But conditions like OCD, which have got a genetic component, there are some youngsters that you could feed them a terrible diet, you could make them grow too quickly, but they do not have any genetic wiring for that disease and they won't get the condition. And then there's, on the other end of the spectrum, there's a group of weanlings that you can look after them perfectly. You can have their diet perfect, you can have their growth rate perfect, you can make sure that they don't go through periods of slow growth followed by periods of rapid growth. You can have everything managed, and they'll still get OCD because they're so genetically predisposed to the condition that you cannot stop them from getting it. And then the biggest group of horses, I think, sit in the middle. So they do have some genetic predisposition to the disease, but if you manage them properly, they won't express the disease. If you manage them improperly, they will express the disease. So that's really where we're working in this entire conversation, is that middle group of horses where if we get their nutrition right, you will keep them without developing any orthopedic diseases when they're young. The other combination of condition score and average daily gain that puts them at high developmental orthopedic disease risk is that if their body condition score is low or normal, but their average daily gain, so their average daily weight gain is low, and that puts them at high developmental orthopedic disease risk as well, because that's what puts them at risk then of rapid periods of compensatory growth after that slow period of growth, which we've already spoken about. So there's lots and lots to think about with energy intake for weanlings. Energy, as I've already mentioned, coming from their forages and any concentrate feeds or grains or high energy fibers that you are feeding them. So it is this, constantly adjusting how much energy you are feeding them according to what their forage is doing and what the climate is doing to try and get them to grow as smoothly as possible. Now, if you have a weanling that has been sick or has had a slow period of growth for any period of time, or if you have come through, a really wet and cold period and they haven't grown very much, something to resist is the temptation to overcompensate. Because if you then feed them when they come out the other side of whatever it is that slowed them down, if you feed them heaps to help them catch up, they will grow like crazy. So remember, they've got this hormonally driven compensatory growth mechanism that is going to make them grow faster anyway. And then if you go and throw a whole heap of feed in on top of that, you'll make them grow really, really fast, and you'll make the problem of this rapid catch-up growth even worse. So it's got to be done. When we see weanlings growing slowly, we will increase their feed, but as little as 250 grams to half a kilo a day for a weanling is actually quite a lot of feed, depending on the size. If you're breeding giant warm bloods, then maybe quantity is a little bit higher than that. But for your average kind of 500 kilogram or 1,100 pound horse, that amount of feed is actually quite a lot. It makes a big difference, and it doesn't take a lot to adjust their diet to get their growth rate up to where you want it. So if you do have weanlings that are growing a bit too slowly, don't go and throw an extra kilogram or an extra 2 pounds of feed into their feed bin. Do it incrementally. Just make changes to their diet slowly and then assess and see where they're at in terms of how fast they're growing, so that you don't accidentally push them into these really rapid rates of growth. So I do want to just emphasize before we move on from energy that a couple of things. So the more you can anticipate what's coming, the smoother your growth will be. And it is this art of, looking ahead and go, what is coming and how are we going to manage that? So rain is coming. Let's make sure that the weanlings are getting a little bit of extra feed. Hot, dry weather coming, pasture quality is going to drop off. Let's make sure that they get a little bit of extra feed. Or it's a lot warmer and a lot drier than it is at this time of year. Let's make sure we don't feed as much as we would feed in a normal year, because we'll be pushing them into rapid growth. It's that balance, constantly looking and seeing and adjusting what you've got in front of you. When I was scribbling my little notes down for this podcast, I was reminded of a stud manager that I worked with. Gosh, it must have been nearly 20 years ago, I reckon. And he was amazing. Simon, his name was, and he was just unbelievable. So he started out with me. They had, there must have been 100 to 150 weanlings at any one time on this farm. And we would weigh them every month, and then I would plot them up so that he could see what the growth rates were, and they would assess body condition. So they would weigh them and assess body condition, and then send me those weights and the body conditions. I would plot them up and send them back to the farm, and then Simon would go through them all, and we would adjust any horses' diets that needed adjusting. And to start with, they were, quite up and down, but over the years, so I'm going to say after a couple of years, he could see what those weanlings were doing and see what they needed. And I've never, ever worked with a farm manager since that had the eye for growing weanlings that this guy had. And it was such a pleasure to work with him because I knew that there was never going to be much to do, and I knew that we were always going to have these beautifully grown weanlings when they got to yearling stage. They're all thoroughbreds, so I knew that we would have these beautifully grown yearlings to send off to sale, and very, very few orthopedic diseases because their diet was really nicely balanced and they were also growing at this beautiful stage of growth. So it's something to aspire to. It is possible. And he learnt just because he was looking at the data all the time, and he was also out there with the young horses all the time watching, and he just learnt to anticipate like no one else I know what those weanlings needed. So it's just I don't know, it was a really cool moment in my career to work with someone like that, because it just showed me what was possible when you paid enough attention to feeding a weanling. The other thing that I want to just make a point of here when we're talking about energy is overfeeding energy will definitely cause in a lot of horses these developmental orthopedic diseases. The other thing that overfeeding energy in the form of cereal grains will cause is gut health issues, and they are a problem in weanlings. If you go back and have a look at old textbooks, the old textbooks will suggest something like 60% concentrate to 40% forage. Now, we know that that is not the ideal way to feed any horse, let alone a weanling. And we also know now from research that's sort of been coming out in the last 3 or 4 years, looking at microbiome and microbiome diversity and a horse's future performance as racehorses, the papers that are published. So, Lang et al. In 2024, I think, published a paper that showed that the microbiome of a foal at 28 days had an impact on that horse's future racing performance. So the better the microbiome at 28 days, the better their performance as a racehorse. And Park et al. Had showed a similar thing in racehorses, that the racehorses with the most diverse microbiomes also had the best performance. So we have to be really conscious when we're feeding these weanlings that we're not inadvertently messing up their hindgut microbiome by feeding them, like if we're trying to grow them through winter, for example, and the only way you can do that is by giving them a whole heap of cereal grain. You will put a lot of starch into that weanling's hindgut, and ultimately you will cause mass disturbance of their hindgut microbiome, which can then have flow-on future effects to their performance later in life. So it's something that we do really want to avoid. I won't go into feeding for hindgut health in this podcast, but if you want to go back and listen to episode 10, I talked there about the 4 rules for a healthy hindgut in horses, and the same 4 rules apply to weanlings. It's all same. So if you follow those 4 rules when you are feeding weanlings and trying to manage their energy intake, you will walk another tightrope. For weanlings, you will walk this balance between giving them enough energy to have them grow in challenging conditions and also not creating negative disturbances to their microbiome. And in fact, if you're really clever with the way you feed your weanlings, you can also cause positive changes in their microbiome and give them the best possible chance of really good performance in the future. I will mention here, just because it's a curious thing that I've noticed over the years, is that I love oats, and you will hear me say it a lot. I really do love oats for horses. I don't like them for weanlings. I notice that weanlings just haven't really learnt the art of taking their time with eating, and they tend to eat quite quickly, and they're lazy chewers. Not all of them, so some of them would be okay in oats, but a lot of them are lazy chewers. So if you are feeding weanlings oats, what I think you will notice, and what I'd love you to pay attention to, is that a lot of the oats will actually end up whole in the manure. And any oat that is whole in the manure, that weanling has got no nutritional benefit from, and you may as well take that oats and just dip it on the ground, because that's as much benefit as that weanling would have gotten from that oat going through its gut. So they won't hurt them as such if they're whole oats, because they're not fermenting in there. And in fact, you'll see them come out in the manure and then they germinate. So the seed is designed to go through a gastrointestinal tract whole. But if you want to feed oats with weanlings, my preference is to feed them steam flaked is great, or even just rolled or crushed, or helping them to break that seed coat open in some way, not whole oats, because I don't tend to chew them very well. So that's energy. That's the energy tightrope of feeding them enough energy to have them growing, but not so much that they grow too quickly. The next part of the diet that becomes a focus for me is the protein, and protein quality in a weanling's diet is crucial. And this is another thing. You can see the impact of protein quality in a weanling's diet. And it's been one of my joys over the years is taking weanlings that are not necessarily on a high quality protein diet and putting them on a high quality protein diet, and then watching them as their muscles grow, because they play so much, right? Like in a mature horse, we often have to increase their protein quality and have them in work so that they muscle up. But these weanlings, if you've ever watched a paddock full of weanlings, or even, just one or two weanlings together, or one, if you've bred a single foal, they run around so much and they're using their bodies and they're trying, they're figuring out all the weird and wonderful things that their bodies can do. They're just playful. And so they're naturally exercising a lot, which means that if you get them, or when you get them on a diet that supports muscle development, they will typically muscle up really, really well. And to me, there is nothing nicer than seeing a group of weanlings that are all beautifully muscled, and there's, that when we bring them into, weanling sales prep or yearling sales prep, or, when you bring them into be started as a youngster, you are not going to have to do a whole heap of work in getting them to put on muscle when you need them to have muscle, because it'll already be there. We will have built it for them when they're young because the diet was supporting muscle development. So protein quality, every time I talk about protein quality on a podcast, I say I will do a podcast on protein quality one day, and I will. But really briefly, protein in every different plant and every different feed ingredient is different, because protein is made up of 20 different amino acids. 10 of them are what we call non-essential amino acids. So the horse, if it needs it, can actually go and find the bits and pieces it needs to put them together in its body, and it will just build them. So if it needs one of those non-essential amino acids, it'll just make it. The other 10 amino acids are what we call essential amino acids, and they're called that because a horse, and it's the same for us as humans, we cannot make them in our body. They have to come in from our diet, it's kind of cool. Like, I like to think of things from an evolutionary perspective. Why is our body this way? Like, why did we evolve to be this way? Why does our brain work this way? Why does a horse's stomach secrete acid 24/7? And it all comes back to the way that we evolved. But it's kind of cool, isn't it, when you think about the fact that there's these essential amino acids, and we get them from eating, from food. So we get them from plants, and horses get them exclusively from plants. We obviously get them from animal products if we're omnivorous as well. But a horse has evolved alongside all of these plants that will provide them these essential amino acids. But the thing is, every plant's protein contains a different level of those essential amino acids. So the proteins that we call high quality protein have got a lot of the most important essential amino acids in them. And the proteins that are low quality proteins have either got very low levels of the essential amino acids, or the essential amino acids they contain are not available for absorption for some reason. So cottonseed meal is a really good example on that one. The cottonseed in its raw form has got a toxic component called gossypol. Now, when they heat the cottonseed to extract the oil from it, that heat process denatures the gossypol. So it's safe to feed, it's no longer toxic anymore. But the problem is the way that the gossypol denatures itself is it goes and attaches itself to lysine. And lysine is the number one limiting essential amino acid in a horse's diet. So there's the three, we call them limiting amino acids because they're the amino acids that a horse is most likely to run out of in its diet. They're lysine, methionine, and threonine. So the gossypol attaches itself to the lysine, which means around 60% of the lysine in cottonseed meal is not available for absorption. So it becomes a very low quality protein because there's lysine there, but the horse can't actually use it. And what happens when we feed these low quality proteins is we don't meet requirements for those essential amino acids. And if you imagine a really simple way to visualize this is if you've got a bricklayer building a brick wall and they run out of bricks, then they can't build any more of the brick wall because they don't have any of the building blocks to continue building the wall. So these amino acids are like bricks. It's just that there's 20 different ones, and every muscle that a young horse needs to build, every protein that a young horse needs to build has got a very specific combination of those amino acids. So if you think about muscle requires a very specific combination of all of those amino acids. And if one of those limiting amino acids runs out, so if your young horse is trying to build muscle but it runs out of lysine, that's like the bricklayer running out of bricks. So they have to stop building muscle because they don't have the bricks they need to continue to build muscle. And you absolutely can see this in young horses if they are not well muscled. I mean, it could be a few things, and I have seen young horses that have got back issues and they have poor muscling. But as a rule, when there is no other problem present, if a young horse is not well muscled or not muscled to its genetic ability, it will be because the protein quality in the diet isn't good enough to support muscle development. So my two favourite protein sources in weanling diets is alfalfa hay and soybean. So one's a forage, obviously. So I love having some lucerne or alfalfa hay in a weanling's diet. And in fact, I don't think I would ever create a weanling diet that didn't have at least some component of lucerne in it. I just love the stuff. It does a whole heap of things. It brings in calcium, which we'll talk about soon as well. But it's got this beautiful protein content that you can use to support good muscle development. And then the other one is soybeans. So soybeans so rich in lysine, the first limiting amino acid, and it's also really rich in threonine, which is one of the other limiting amino acids. It does have decent amounts of methionine. It's not really rich in that one. But any young horse that is on a diet that contains a component of lucerne and soybean, they typically are really, really well muscled. And any young horses that are on diets that have got really poor quality protein, they just won't have the muscle there that they should have there. So my big rule for weanling rations is that you need to know where your protein is coming from. If you're buying commercial feeds, you absolutely need to know where your protein is coming from. And if it's mostly an Australian thing, but we will have lots of feeds that are just list vegetable protein meal, and you don't know what that vegetable protein meal is. So if you're feeding a weanling, they're okay to use for horses that don't need to do a whole lot in terms of building muscle. But if you're feeding a weanling and you want your weanling to be able to build muscle to their genetic capabilities, and avoid anything that doesn't specify where the protein is coming from. And to go a step further, my preference is to look for feeds that do contain soybean as one of their primary sources of protein, so that you're getting this really, really high quality protein in their diet. Protein is also really important for proper bone development. So it is a muscle thing, but it's also, you really want them to have proper bone development, and you've got to make sure that they've got the right amino acids to be able to build their bone protein matrices that they then build their bone around. Okay, so that's protein, and we'll move on now to minerals. So this is now getting down to the real nitty-gritty of a weanling's diet. And every part of a weanling's diet is really important, but the minerals are very important. I don't know whether I'd put energy. Actually, I think I'd put mineral content above energy content in terms of importance in a weanling's diet, because if you get mineral intake wrong with a weanling, you will cause lifetime soundness issues. So you can't, a weanling simply cannot grow proper bone or cartilage unless you have got the mineral content and also the mineral ratios in their diet correct. So as a really stark example of when it goes wrong, I have worked with farms and thankfully bought them back from this, but I have worked with farms where they're on high oxalate grasses, so they'll have something like kaiku as their pasture base, and kaiku is one of those grasses that contains oxalate, and oxalate loves calcium and essentially steals it from horses. So weanlings growing up on those pastures, unless you do a brilliant job of managing their mineral intake, their calcium intake, they will end up calcium deficient. And these farms, and there's more than one of them that I've worked with over the years, they will have more than 50% of their young horses end up with OCD, which is a disaster because their sales value of the thoroughbreds drops. You end up having to do all of these surgeries because they'll get cartilage flaps and joint mice, little bits of cartilage floating around in their joints. So mineral balance in a horse's diet is so important. If you get it wrong, it can be a disaster. And if this is your one and only, so I've personally bred 2 horses in my lives, and they've been 2 from very, very special mares. I still have both of the horses that I bred. Poet is now, gosh, she must be turning 23 this year, and Popcorn's mid-teens. So, if you've got that very special, they're both really special to me, those horses. If you've just got one weanling and that one weanling ends up with OCD because the mineral balance isn't right in the diet, that's a disaster too. You don't want that to happen. So it is really important that you get minerals right. I'm going to say at the outset here, so that I don't make your head spin with numbers and ratios, this again is why we build the My Happy Horse Nutrition app, because it shows you really simply whether your weanling is getting enough of the minerals that are really important. So things like calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium are really important because they're the 3 most abundant minerals in bone. And then other minerals like copper, zinc, and manganese are really, really important because they're super important for making sure that cartilage can form properly and that cartilage can turn into bone properly. All of those things that are happening at a rapid rate of knots inside a weanling's body. You can see using My Happy Horse that you're either meeting requirements or not meeting requirements. And if you're not, then you can get it balanced up. And you can also make sure that all of these minerals are in the right ratio to each other, because having the wrong ratio is as damaging as not having enough of these minerals in the diet. So a tool to help you analyze the diet is invaluable when you're feeding weanlings, because then you know that you're getting it right and you're not worrying about missing something and having a deficiency and causing problems. So as I just mentioned, the bone minerals I think of as calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium, really, really important. They do come in from your forages. So lucerne, this is part of the reason why I love lucerne, is because it is really rich in calcium. So it brings a lot of calcium to a diet for you. Grain-based feeds will bring a lot of phosphorus to a diet for you. You have to make sure calcium and phosphorus are balanced in the diet. And weanlings are more sensitive to, certainly too much phosphorus and not enough calcium will affect them. And in fact, more than 50%, I want to say something like around 80% of pastures that I have tested in the Hunter Valley, and it's like well over 1,000 samples now, have got a calcium to phosphorus ratio that is less than 1:1. So there's more phosphorus in a lot of those pastures than there is calcium, and particularly when the pastures are young and lush and growing fast, and particularly if they've had phosphorus fertilizer added to them. So you actually get this imbalanced calcium to phosphorus ratio coming in from the pastures. And if you are not aware of that and you're not balancing up the overall diet to make sure that the overall calcium to phosphorus ratio is balanced, you will also end up with massive issues with joint diseases like OCD. And in fact, one of the pastures that I tested in the Hunter had a calcium to phosphorus ratio of 0.29 to 1. It will cause big head at that level if you were not supplementing them properly, and they would actually be at really high risk of fracturing their bones, let alone OCD. OCD would be the least of their worries if they were on a pasture like that and not being supplemented properly. So it's really important to get those bone minerals right, and it's really important to be conscious of the calcium and phosphorus that's coming from your forages and making sure that you're either not getting too much phosphorus, or if you're feeding a really legume-rich diet. So, sometimes I see weanlings on lucerne pastures, or sometimes I see them just getting lucerne hay. The opposite problem can then happen. So you'll get too much calcium and not enough phosphorus. And the youngsters, you don't want to go above a calcium to phosphorus ratio of 3:1. Again, the My Happy Horse Nutrition app will catch you if your calcium to phosphorus ratio goes above that, and you can make sure that you either reduce the calcium that you're feeding, or you might have to increase the phosphorus that you're feeding. And then the trace minerals that are really important for bone are copper, zinc, and manganese. And then there's other minerals. So selenium and iodine, for example, are really, really important. Iodine, they absolutely have to have their requirement met to help them to make sure that they grow. When they become iodine deficient, they won't grow properly. And selenium they need for growth. They will also slow their growth down if they're selenium deficient. They are prone to muscle diseases if they're selenium deficient. And also their immune function won't be very good. Zinc and selenium are really important for immune function. So if you've got weanlings that are trace mineral deficient, and particularly selenium and zinc deficient, then they're also going to be really prone to all the snotty nose diseases that they can get. And when they get sick, their growth slows down, and then once they get better, they shoot off into that compensatory growth mechanism and the really rapid growth for a period of time, which then increases their risk of OCD. So it's such a big picture thing feeding a weanling. You have to have all of the bits just right to make sure that they're growing at the right rate, that they stay healthy, that they're muscling, and that their bones and joints are developing in a way that will give them a lifetime of soundness. It's just such a crucial period of nutrition. I hope that I'm getting this across to you. Hopefully you can hear it in my voice. I do get very passionate about feeding weanlings. So there's a few ways that you can add the minerals to a horse's diet. And I will say in today's age, most of the feeds that are developed for broodmares and young growing horses have got a really good balance of minerals in them. I remember when I first started, it was more of a thing that sometimes feeds wouldn't quite get their mineral balance right, but most feeds are pretty good these days with their mineral balance. But again, you do want to check using the My Happy Horse Nutrition app, because you want to make sure that the feeding rate that you're using is actually giving your weanlings enough of all of these minerals to meet their requirements. So you can use balancer pellets. Balancer pellets are absolutely gold when it comes to feeding a weanling. I love them because they allow you to meet their mineral requirement and also adjust their energy intake. So if you're giving them a set amount of balancer pellet every day and that doesn't change, and then you might be bringing in other feed ingredients to give them energy when they need it, or you can reduce it if they need reduced energy, but you're not actually changing their mineral intake. Complete feeds are also great. The caution with complete feeds is that they are bringing in your energy and your protein and your minerals. So, and vitamins. I won't talk a lot about vitamins. Vitamins are also really important for weanlings, but I won't talk about them a lot. Again, just make sure that they are balanced up and their requirements are met in their diet when you're balancing the diet for all of the other nutrients. But because the mineral content is attached to the energy content in a complete feed, if you reduce that complete feed to control their energy intake because they're growing too quickly, which is absolutely what you need to do, you just need to be conscious that you'll then need to bring in a component of balancer pellet or of some kind of vitamin and mineral supplement to fix those gaps that you will have created in mineral intake by reducing the complete feed. A strategy that I've used a lot over the years is using a complete feed and a balancer pellet together. So you might have the balancer pellet, only the balancer pellet if your forage quality is really good and your weanlings are able to grow at the rate you want them to grow just on the forage and the balancer pellet. On the other end of the spectrum, you might have, like, say, for a 300 kilogram weanling, you might have 3 kilograms of hard feed in their diet because they need that much. It might be cold, it might be wet. Your forage quality might be really poor, so that they need that full amount of a complete feed. But then in the middle, you might have a situation where they need 1.5 kilograms of complete feed or fortified feed. If you're listening in the US, we call complete feeds here in Australia our fortified feeds. I know for you a complete feed is a feed that you just feed that and you don't have to add even forage to, but I'm talking about a fortified feed. If you're feeding 1.5 kilos of fortified feed, and you can then also add a component of balancer pellet just to top up the vitamin and mineral intake. So there's lots of different ways you can feed those two feed ingredients together, and it just depends on your preference. So the three main ways to feed a weanling would be just balance a pellet and your forage. And we do that on a regular basis when there's really high quality pasture available, because they will grow really quickly on very high quality pasture. You can have a fortified feed and forage, like we just talked about, or you can have both the feed and the balancer pellet together with the forage. It just depends what the situation is. And again, this is where My Happy Horse, it just helps you out so much, because you'll be able to see any gaps in the diet and you'll know exactly that you need, you might only need to add 150 grams per day of balancer pellet to balance up a diet that's based on a fortified feed. It'll help you to make sure that you are meeting nutrient requirements, and it will also help you to not waste money. So not feeding more balancer pellet than you need to because you're worried that you're not going to be meeting their nutrient requirements. But yeah, that's about all I can fit into one podcast on weanlings. Honestly, I could tell you stories about feeding weanlings for days at a time. I do have one story I wanted to share. There was a farm years ago. I was just about to give birth to my son, Bo, and he's about to turn 13. So there you go. It's exactly 13 years ago. And this particular farm, they were on the coast. They were on Kaikiu, so high oxalate pastures, and they did have an OCD rate of 50% plus in their young horses. And these are expensive thoroughbreds. And the obviously sales results weren't very good when you've got that much OCD in your young horse herd. So I'd been right through all of the diets, and the only way that I could get enough calcium into those diets to counteract both the high oxalate content of the pasture and the high phosphorus content of the pasture was to make sure that those weanlings were fed 2 kilograms of lucerne hay per day, as well as the feed and the balancer pellet that they were on. So then fast forward 12 months' time, and we'd done all of this work on their diet, sent the recommendations back, fast forward 12 months' time, and same thing, massively high OCD rates. And this farm owner was absolutely irate. And he even went so far as to suggest that perhaps with being pregnant, my brain wasn't working very well and I'd stuffed the diets up. It eventually filtered out that he had not fed the hay. He didn't want to because he had so much pasture. He didn't see the sense in wasting money on the lucerne hay. And so they just hadn't fed the lucerne hay. And once he had admitted to that, we got him to agree to follow what I had recommended properly and feed the lucerne hay. And the next year, I can't remember the exact numbers now, but it was back down to what we would consider a normal level of OCD, like sub 15% of the horses that were affected. So it made a massive difference, huge difference. Yet another demonstration of how important nutrition is for weanlings. So to really briefly recap, you've got to walk this tightrope of energy. So you have to feed them enough to make sure that they grow without feeding them so much that they grow too quickly. When I first started, when I was a baby nutritionist, I would regularly see particularly in the standard bred industry, I think a lot of farms were so scared of feeding their young horses because they thought that if they fed them to have them grow, they would also get joint disease. But what I now know is that when they talked about feeding them, they were only talking about giving them oats. So what was happening in those situations is that they would give them oats and they'd make them grow faster, but they weren't bringing in the mineral part of the diet as well. So they were essentially outstripping the horse's ability to grow in a sound manner because they were making them grow fast, but they also weren't supporting them with the right mineral profile to grow in a sound way, to develop bones and joints that were actually healthy. So it was a reasonably common practice or a reasonably common thing, I should say, to be scared of feeding young horses because people were so scared of causing joint disease. But what we now know to be true is that we can feed them. You just have to make sure you feed them a balanced diet so that you're supporting the young horses with the minerals they need to grow at the rate they're growing at when you're actually adding energy into their diet. So it is a tightrope. You have to have them grow. We want them to grow to their genetic potential. We just don't want them to grow too fast and end up with some sort of developmental orthopedic disease. Remember that protein quality is really important. Go looking for your high quality proteins and avoid feeds or products that you don't know where the protein source is coming from and you can't be sure that it's high quality protein. And then it's really, really, really important that you analyse your weanlings' diets carefully and make sure that you're meeting their requirement for calcium, phosphorus and magnesium, and that all of those minerals are in the right ratios with one another, and also that you are meeting their trace mineral requirements, both so that they grow and stay healthy and also so that they can develop healthy cartilage and bone. I hope I haven't just made your head spin like mine was spinning after looking at all of those weanlings in Japan. That was such a funny day. They haven't done that since. They just bring me the problem weanlings now to look at, which is a lot easier. But the thing I love about my work over in Japan is that for every single weanling they also show me a full diet history, and they show me, all of their body weights taken over time and their average daily weight gain. So I can do the art and the science so easily because I can see the horse in front of me and I can also see all of their data. It's such a brilliant way to raise weanlings, regardless of whether you have one bred from a very special mare or whether you've got a couple of hundred sitting out in a paddock, multiple paddocks that you are responsible for. Combining the art and the science of nutrition is always going to give you the best result with your weanlings. So thank you very, very much for listening. Please do follow our podcast. It helps us out. It helps us be found by more horse owners who need this information. We'd love you to share this with anyone who you might think would benefit from this information. And thank you very much for being here, and we'll catch you in the next episode. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse virtual equine nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also while you're there, check out the Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.